Welcome to this webinar on endangered archaeology in Mauritania. Something a little bit different for us. My name is Matthew Anderson of the MBBC. Just a couple of parish notices before we kick off. Firstly, we have a trade mission planned for the first week of February next year. If you're interested in that, please get in touch with us via the usual means or drop a comment in the chat box. Also, we are planning a series of events now in the run up to Christmas, including potential webinars like this and some in-person events. So do check our social media and indeed all our various channels like LinkedIn and our mailing list when we send them out for further details. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Peter Tesh now, another director of MBBC, who is involved with this project, and we'll give an introduction and an overview. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome members of the EAMENA Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa program, with whom I have been in touch since 2015, when the then Minister for Higher Education and Scientific Research, Dr. Sidi Woodwalem, visited Oxford and met the then program director, Bob Bewley. So that is the beginning of the relationship between Mauritania and EAMENA. We have in the meantime signed an MOU with the University of Nouakchott, and we're just waiting on the COVID situation to a bit more become travel friendly and to start a training program. So I have already mentioned Dr. Bob Bewley. He was the first program director of EAMENA. He started the event. He has a big background also in national heritage, archaeology, aerial archaeology. He will speak first, and then it will be followed by our current program director, Bill Finley, Dr. Bill Finley, who we have met already at the ambassador, the lunch with the British ambassador in Nouakchott earlier in September, and he is indeed also a specialist in field archaeology, and he's now kicked off in this function with the EAMENA. And then we will have Gonzalo Matas will speak as a doctoral student of St. Jude's College, Oxford, on remote sensing archaeology, which is the proper term for the kind of this new form of archaeology by satellite or aerial photography. And then it will be followed by a question and answer session by Professor David Mattingly, Professor of Roman Archaeology at the University of Leicester, who is well known to some of the BP people for his work on the civilization of the Garamantes in southern Libya. And also he will be joined by Professor Andrew Wilson from Oxford University, the archaeologist of the Roman Empire, but who has worked extensively in North Africa, Libya, Tunisia, etc. They will do the Q&A. So I ask Robert or Bob to start the session. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and also huge thank you to Roger, Matthew and the MBBC for putting this on. And I'm going to try and attempt the impossible, which is to summarize remote sensing in 5 minutes, because actually the key moment of today is Gonzalo's discoveries, which has a COVID related story. I don't know if he'll tell you it, but remote sensing has come into its own in these COVID years. But very quickly, I'm going to cover the sources, the discovery and monitoring, which are the three things that we can do in terms of remote sensing. But the bit in italic says the aim of landscape archaeology to understand past human behavior at a landscape scale through prehistory and history. So we're trying to understand what human beings were doing at different times using all the techniques available to archaeologists. And the game changer really in the last 20 years has been the publicly available satellite imagery. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of the background because you'll hear more about the use of satellite imagery from Bill and from Gonzalo. And I often start many talks like this with this photograph of Stonehenge, 1906, from a hot air balloon, very early example of remote sensing. And the purpose of showing it is that things change over time, no matter how important they are, and that you can see things from different perspectives, and not all archaeologists excavate. So this new form of archaeology, remote sensing, doesn't make us any less of archaeologists. It's just a new tool in our toolbox. And why the Middle East and North Africa? Well, there have been many pioneers of work across the Middle East and North Africa. And I just showed two examples. One from this wonderful book, Flights Over the Ancient Cities of Iran by Eric Schmidt in 1940. He was actually just excavating Persepolis, but his wife, who happened to be American, happened to know about aerial archaeology, said, no, you need to use the aeroplane you're going to use as a taxi to get from Tehran to Persepolis to undertake aerial survey. And he did, and published this book. It's available online through the Chicago Oriental Institute, and I thoroughly recommend it. And the other was this on the right, La Trace de Rome dans le désert de Syrie by Antoine Poindebar. Again, a wonderful pioneer, fantastic publication if you can see it. And Poindebar was either a Jesuit priest or an engineer or a spy or an archaeologist. And it turns out he was more a spy than anything else, but managed to take some wonderful photographs in the meantime. And then an iconic image from Aerofilms, which was a commercial company, and they took lots of photographs of huge swathes of Middle East and North Africa, but they're really important documents now to show just how much has changed since these photographs were taken, because many of the sites that we might wish to record have now disappeared. So the historical sources are really important. And how do we do it? It is often as simple as just sitting in an aircraft with the door open or the window open and taking aerial photographs. And this is just Matt Dalton and I doing some work in Saudi Arabia last year. Handheld digital cameras. Obviously, the better quality the camera, the better quality the image. That's a good thing to have. And then global positioning systems so that we can record where we've been and what we photographed. So it isn't the aerial reconnaissance isn't particularly difficult or highly technical, but the results can be absolutely stunning. And this is where we get to the discovery side of it all. And this is a site in the Black Basalt Desert of Jordan, which we hadn't seen before, but that's zooming in on it, and it probably relates to some either probably Bronze Age or slightly later. But then when you zoom out again, you can see that the bulldozer driver, and one of the things all archaeologists know, particularly in the Middle East, is the bulldozers get everywhere. No matter how far you are from human habitation, there will be evidence of bulldozer drivers. And on this one, you can see the driver is going up the hill, decides it's far too steep and goes around the side and doesn't totally destroy the site. And just a little advert for the aerial archaeology in Jordan and the Apami archive of air photographs. If you want to see 100,000 aerial photographs, have a look at the Apami website, which and the website address is bottom right. And then just returning to Stonehenge, here it is in 2017, very different from the picture you saw from 1906. Not only has it changed beyond recognition in that the green swathe, the green line you can see in the bottom of the picture was the A344, so that was built since 1906, but then closed and grassed over, because they realized having cars going that close to such an important monument was not a good thing. So the monitoring never ends. And a lot of people say, well, haven't you discovered everything that there is to be discovered? And the answer is no. And then I just want to end with 3 images to show why it's so important we do what we do. Bill will go into details of the other forms of destruction, but this one is looking at this amazing site using satellite imagery called Dura Europus up on the Euphrates in Syria. And there it is on the 28th of December 2011, relatively untouched, except by archaeologists. And you can see that their spoil tips on the edge of the site just here, and then excavations within this. A highly significant site, classical site, in terms of trade and contact between huge swathes of people in terms of the way in which artifacts, objects were imported, exported, and obviously on the Euphrates, an important trade route. But here it is in April 2014, and so the troubles in Syria at their height, every black dot you can see on there is a looting pit. And we know from some of the sources that ISIS were taking money for licenses to be able to excavate each of those. And that's just it in more detail. And the EAMENA project commissioned some work, commissioned these satellite images to be taken because of the concern over the importance of the site and just how much has been destroyed. What we don't know is how deep those holes go, because it's not possible to visit yet. But that's just one example of many that we could have used just to highlight the use of satellite imagery and also the importance of doing it now. And then my final slide, why are we doing all this? Well, we're at the sort of top of this, what we refer to as the heritage cycle. Peter mentioned in the introduction, I'd worked for various heritage organizations, and this was referred to as the heritage cycle. So if we can understand what we're seeing and the cultural heritage, people will value it. And the value can be all sorts of reasons, economic, social, enjoyment. But if you value it, you care for it. And if you care for it, then you can enjoy it and let people see it. So there is a tourism angle to all this. And the more you enjoy it, the more people ask questions, and the more you can understand it. Hence the heritage cycle. And that's the end of my talk. So I can now stop sharing and hand over to Bill Finlayson. Thank you very much.
This following on from Bob and giving you some background on the project itself. The Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa, for those who are wondering what EAMENA stands for, but far too much of a mouthful, so almost always abbreviated to EAMENA. And here on this first slide, you can see the sorts of things that inspired the project in the first place. I think this was originally when Syria started to go downhill sharply and ISIS started to use the destruction of archaeological sites as a way of gaining publicity and gaining political angles that they wanted to pursue. So that produced a lot of very public scenes, which were all over the news at the time. But at the same time, on the other side of the screen, you can see what's actually an equal, if not much, much bigger problem, which is just the pressure of development, agricultural expansion, and so on. And you can see an archaeological site that's been cut and destroyed by the development of what looks like an olive grove there. So you can see the sorts of things that we're dealing, and what inspired this project to be set up in the first place. And we're lucky today, we've got Andrew Wilson and David Mattingly joining us, two of the PIs at Oxford and Leicester. And this was set up originally with funding from the Arcadia Trust, who continued to give us very generous funding to keep the whole project going. And they were, I think, very much struck by the danger of all the public damage that was being done. The story is a little bit different as we'll come into things. And modern archaeology, Bob touched on this a little bit, it's driven very much by development and threats to sites. We very rarely excavate sites that are pristine and safe from any threat. A lot of it's driven, in particular in places like Britain and Western Europe, by development. So we target things where there is inevitable damage going to happen, whether it's from anthropogenic development or accidental things such as sea level rise and erosion and so on. And my own background in this was very much started in this project back in 1990, the Northwest Ethylene Pipeline, which running from Grangemouth south to England had to cross two major Roman features. So you have to cross the Antonine Wall and you have to cross Hadrian's Wall if you're doing anything like this going through Britain. And what we were able to do, because of the whole idea of controlled archaeological knowledge and the planning process, was to actually run through things in detail. So you can see on the bottom right, an archaeological trench running through here, the Antonine Wall. You can see the footing of the Antonine Wall crossing perpendicular to the trench. And basically the pipeline was excavated, the trench for the pipeline was excavated by hand by archaeologists without any disturbance by the machine diggers. and the pipe was simply dropped into the slot left by the archaeologists. And the point of this is to show you that, you know, if you're in a context where you know your archaeological resource, you know the heritage, you can put it down on maps, then you can work with both the planning authorities, you can work with developers, you can work with known threats such as those arising from climate change. And that's important in that it saves both developers from being hit by nasty surprises of unknown archaeology, and it also protects the archaeology because where possible, if you know about it in advance, you can simply have it avoided by development. Why EAMENA? Why, in fact, why the MENA region? And that's, I think, clear to all of us that work in archaeology, but not perhaps always so obvious to people outside archaeology. It is perhaps the single most important area in the world, right from the start of humanity leaving Africa. And they come out of Africa in two main ways, one of which is through the Middle East going up the Levantine corridor, and one, of course, is up through northwest Africa going across the Straits of Gibraltar. So right from the word go in human history, it's been a very important region. And of course, we all know the more recent history, the birth of major religions, the start of farming, the rise and fall of great empires. It all happens in this part of the world. So hugely important archaeological record and with a lot of international significance. At the same time, the pace of development in the region has been increasing exponentially. And the impact of all these threats we talk about, conflict, looting, climate change, agricultural activity, uncontrolled development, construction, is moving faster and faster. And we need to understand what's happening to the archaeological record to be able to preserve it. Another aspect of the need is that until recently, in most countries of the region, except for a very few like Jordan, there are no digital records in existence. There are no central systematic national heritage records. And our approach is very much geared to allow these databases to be built, both for the individual states, but also for our own central comprehensive database. So we're very much about building up that informational database that lets us assess the threat, lets us try and protect sites, and let us work with planning systems. And we have, over the years, been building up an understanding of what those threats really are. And to some extent, it's not the conflict ones, we'll come to those, but it is the much larger scale things like new irrigation systems, ploughing of very large areas, terracing, modern terraces being built, orchards going in, intensive animal grazing and so on, which is obviously damaging the soil cover of sites. Conflict, of course, there's all sorts of aspects to conflict. I mean, there's the direct damage from bombardment, shelling and explosions. There's vandalism that comes up in conflict as you lose control of ordinary patterns of behavior. And then there's the reuse of sites. One of the unfortunate things about many archaeological sites is that they make good military watch posts and so on. They're located in precisely the right areas, and castles and things get reused as little bases and so on. So there's a lot of damage from reuse of archaeological sites. Construction is a very broad category of things, and you could argue some of these belong to other things because several of these are promoted by the conflict, like refugee camps. And I don't know if you've seen any of the really large refugee camps that are dotted around much of the Middle East, but they're enormous urban settlements that just sprung up overnight and very quickly, and not necessarily with very much planning and organization because of the emergency nature of their construction. Urban expansion itself is a huge threat, and we'll come back to that. Road building, Bob showed the bulldozers that are driving around the region, making roads, and of course that's the relatively informal local roads. We have massive motorway expansion and so on. Dam projects, famously a threat to archaeology, as they often flood areas that have been very rich and fertile in the past, and so on with all of these things. Archaeology, of course, to some extent, old-fashioned archaeology, when people went in and dug large sites with perhaps not too much care and attention, as a threat in itself. Looting, something of a threat. Bob showed the site of Dura Europos. There are plenty of examples of this. Looting and illegal excavation, and illegal excavation particularly where an organization such as ISIS has actually promoted excavation as a means of funding themselves through the sale of antiquities, and conducted it in their own state system as a peculiar activity which is actually taxed and therefore highly encouraged by them. And then, of course, natural threats. And these are all being compounded by climate change. So things like water erosion, wind erosion, and the movement of formerly stable sand dunes are all impacting archaeological sites. And just to show you the area, I think, you know, we all talk quite glibly about the Middle East and North Africa. And I show it on the globe here because it is a peculiarly huge area. I think we underestimate just how big this area is. And that's one of the reasons why remote sensing by satellite imagery is so important. There is no way you could even imagine approaching such a large area without the new technology of satellite interpretation. The activities we do, as I think it's clear, we obviously try and identify and understand the archaeology of the region. And despite our project title, it's not just the endangered sites we're looking at, because we're trying to build up this comprehensive database so we can understand the heritage in each country, and we can locate sites before they come under any threat, so we know where the resource is. And we monitor change, assessing the site condition, checking what the threats are and what damage is being caused. Increasingly during the course of the programme, we're training people, particularly training national heritage management staff in the methodology and trying to get them to build up their own support networks and share knowledge between each country. And more broadly, we're trying to raise awareness and encourage debate about the whole issue more widely in the international community. So the sources of information, Bob's already touched on most of these, in fact, the remote sensing. And one of the key things with remote sensing is that satellite imagery, there's a large quantity of satellite imagery through organizations such as Google Earth and Bing that's free. So we can do a lot of work without having to pay for satellite coverage. The other thing is a lot of commercial satellite imagery has now become much, much cheaper. So that can be used when we need higher resolution imagery, or when we want frequent pass imagery, because increasingly there are satellite companies that you can actually book imagery from repeat pass. And that's very useful, particularly if we're monitoring an ongoing threat to a site. If, however, we only use the satellite imagery, we would miss all the previous work that's been done. So we do hoover up a lot of the existing data sets, the gazetteers and archives. And as Bob mentioned, we include historic photographs and also map resources. There's a huge amount of map resources from particularly this region, many of which date back to the colonial periods, which have a lot of information, as with the historic photographs, that predates the rapid rise of modern development. So they include a lot that has since been lost or become less visible. And finally, we do some field work to try and calibrate the results of all these techniques and bring them together. And there are some things, you know, as Bob mentioned, the depth of holes in sites that you just can't pick up. So that there is field work to calibrate these results. And Bob showed you an example from Jordan. Here's an example from Yemen. There are still surprisingly big and elaborate sites that come up brand new that haven't been discovered before, at least are unknown to the wider world, possibly known to the local herders and so on, but not known to archaeologists or state agencies. The database is getting very large now, and we've been running since 2015, and there's over 340,000 records in it. And the area of survey that we've undertaken is about 1.5 million square kilometers over most of the countries of the region. And this is just one of the opening shots from the database. And you can see here that the EAMENA project, and we're also joined by the MARIA project, which does the coastal archaeology based at Southampton and Ulster universities. So one of the ways that this whole endeavor becomes possible is that this is actually a combination of 5 university teams working together, which helps enormously in covering the ground. And this is just one opening shot from going into the database, where you can see very dense coverage, particularly in the Middle East and in parts of North Africa, much less as you move west in North Africa. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why we're here today, is that we're trying to begin the expansion into this direction. Monitoring change, I said, one of our activities, and here, and this is one of Bob's helicopter shots, I believe. And you can see this Islamic caravanserai sitting remarkably well preserved, although you can see quite a lot of again, bulldozer activity in the fields around. But just a few years later, the olive groves have gone in. You can see where they've actually been planted, and you can also see where the pits have been dug for them and not yet been planted. And you can see half the site's been bulldozed away, but it's not actually just been bulldozed away, it's been mounded up to put a water tank on top for the irrigation of these olives. And this is the sort of damage that often funded by grant assistance and so on, which, there's not necessarily joined up approaches to some of the way development happens, where one department will be giving money for people to go and do something, where another department, in this case the cultural heritage one, will be finding it very hard to protect the sites in the face of the urgent need for development and agriculture. Urban change, I mentioned, this is out at the edges of Amman, a site called Yajuz, and back in 2004, it's just on the very fringes of the city. In fact, it's pretty rural still. You can see fields around and so on. The core of the site's where the yellow pin is. And just 10 years later, you can see the urban sprawl is beginning to come and really encroach on the site. The dirt tracks are now impinging on it by being dug out and with a hard top put onto them. So you can see the spread of urban growth, and this has continued. I mean, if we took an image from now, you'd see still further damage to the site. And of course, as I mentioned, we try and get involved in the planning process. And this is a case study that was done a number of years ago, but which I think is still a very good example of what happens, where an approach much like the approach you'd follow in Britain was adopted, and the Jordanian Department of Antiquities accepted an offer for assistance from EAMENA and worked around the historic town of Madaba, helping the planning process, guide the route for a new ring road that was put in, and guide any mitigation measures that might be required. So a very successful case study bringing together the methodology of EAMENA and the local heritage agencies' planning work. And this is just to mention that condition assessment is important, and it's one of the reasons for ground visits is to check the condition of sites. And of course, with smartphones and so on, this now has become a much easier exercise in recording than it used to be. And the last big activity, training, which has been rising in recent years, thanks to funding by the British Council's Cultural Protection Fund, which comes from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and has been a very helpful source of funding for many projects, not just EAMENA, driven in part by ODA budgets and so on. And it's helpful to us for a number of reasons. Partly because we get a large number of assistants through it to join in the project, but it also really embeds us with the local departments of antiquities, helps them take our advice more seriously and more in depth, and it very much in the idea of localizing our work is a really important step. And the training we conduct, we've trained about 180 trainees from the 8 countries that have been inside this Cultural Protection Fund program, teaching them all the skills that are necessary to adopt the methodology. And it's been significantly useful in a number of countries. Yemen, despite the difficulties of working and doing anything in Yemen, the trainees in Yemen are still very busy on their own back, actively adding sites on a daily basis to the database there. So it's a very effective program. And it also helps as we move on to persuading people about the need to develop their own national heritage databases, because there's a cadre of staff who can operate these at the level of being trained archaeologists. The training also has come in very helpful. Here's an emergency response where our training was very important after the big explosion in Beirut that you will all have seen in the harbour. Trainees staff from the Directorate General of Antiquities in Lebanon that we had trained were able to document the buildings damaged in the explosion using a mobile app that was then uploaded into our database. So directly making quite a big impact. And as I say, we're now in the throes of creating national heritage databases. And here's the front end from the Palestine one, which has been set up, and we're about to undertake more training in it. And Palestine has taken the whole thing so seriously that they've actually enacted a new heritage law that requires them to run this database. So you can see the sort of success of the program in cultural heritage protection. And just again, another one of these little snapshots showing you the sort of database, and you can see the West Bank and down there in the Gaza Strip there, large numbers of sites that have been recorded. And most of the ones on the map at the moment are the ones recorded by the Palestinian trainees. So just to conclude, I mean, our work's going on. We've got funding till 2024 at the moment. We're still doing the basic research, increasingly in partnership with local archaeologists. and we're trying to bring in additional countries. And here we are again. This is again one of the reasons why we're in conversations with some of the authorities and universities in Mauritania. And we're handing over the ownership of national databases while maintaining our central database. And that we think is absolutely crucial. So these countries take this on as part of their in-house development process. And the latest piece of training that we're just about to start with new funding from the British Council is to start teaching people the backroom side of maintaining the databases and the servers and things, to make sure that these things are really sustainable and they can be independent in their management and don't need to keep on calling for assistance, but can actually run the databases themselves. So that's me. I will now step off, and Gonzalo will now show you some of the actual archaeology.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you also, Bob, for your presentation. Let me share. So following on Bob's suggestion of introducing a bit how this project came to being in Mauritania, before starting my PhD, I hadn't had any prior experience of remote sensing at all. And indeed, I was planning to do something on kind of more early human evolution, looking at museum collections and digging sites. But then kind of COVID hit, and it was then a scramble for finding a viable project, because for the foreseeable future, the non-remote sensing alternatives of archaeology were going to be kind of completely blocked off. So beyond kind of the odd lecture, I wasn't very familiar with the archaeology of Mauritania at all. But it emerged as a very fruitful avenue of research because it combined the high visibility of stone-built sites that stand out from the surrounding desert landscape. And as I will explain later, a number of technical affordances of the satellite imagery that made it particularly successful. So today I'm going to talk about my PhD thesis, and that explores the way in which people lived in the landscapes of southern Mauritania for over 3 millennia, and how those changed as the climate became more arid and the Sahara kind of encroached further south. I will also look at the way people dealt with their dead and how they were placing funerary monuments in the landscape. And lastly, we will talk about, I will talk about briefly about trade and interaction during the medieval period, when the Sahara really became a hub of commerce, connecting West Africa, North Africa, and the wider world. Why Mauritania and why remote sensing? So the first reason why a remote sensing project in Mauritania is exciting is because there are almost no alternatives. In the area that I'm looking at, which is kind of between Tijikia and Tichit, no fieldwork was carried out since in the early 2000s, even before the pandemic. So it was really kind of the only avenue to enter the study of the prehistory of this region. And this is a map of the Foreign Office of the UK, kind of limiting them where academics can travel with the university insurance. And then the second really important aspect is the freely available kind of very high resolution imagery that is freely available on some of the platforms that both Bob and Bill were mentioning. I specifically use Bing Maps because for this part of Mauritania, the resolution is absolutely excellent. And here we can see 3 examples of funerary tumuli. And on the right side, we see household compounds, so where people would have been living. This map shows a bit kind of my work over the past 2 years in collaboration with my friend Jonathan Lim, also a DPhil student in the University of Oxford. We've kind of surveyed a very large area of the highlands of southern and southeastern Mauritania. And we've documented almost 10,000 sites, spanning all the different escarpments that kind of surround the Aukar Basin. So, and in this presentation, I'll be very briefly talking first about Dartichit, secondly about Dartagan to the west of it, and then we'll conclude looking at the highlands where the medieval trading city of Tetgaus was located. It's a very brief introduction, kind of the occupation of this part of Mauritania by mobile agropastoralist and hunter-gatherer communities began around 2000 BC, so kind of 4,000 years ago, when the Central Sahara became hyper-arid and forced communities to move south into areas that were greener for their cattle. And then over time, we see a process of consolidation and expansion of archaeological sites, like the one we see in the image, Archeology, where really sites become a lot more complex and larger amounts of people start living in the same place, relying on the cultivation of pearl millet and the cattle keeping and livestock herding. And then towards the 1000 BC, we see a really sharp increase in aridity in this part of Mauritania. The core settlement area becomes depopulated, and we see populations moving towards the west and the south into Mali. And then the region flourishes again during the Islamic period and the kind of consolidation of trans-Saharan trade routes. So these are the three main avenues of my thesis that I already mentioned. You know, how people live, how people deal with their dead, and how they interact with other communities. For the first aspect, one of the themes that I'm focusing on is to what extent can we identify differences in the status of the people living in these communities when we don't see particular asymmetries in the material wealth of the assemblages. You know, can the size of the places where they were living give us insights about who was more powerful within a society? So I patiently measured every one of these compounds, and then, you know, some really interesting patterns started to emerge. And this is a paper that I've just submitted to an international journal. So towards the center of the site, we see these larger compounds surrounded by smaller ones, you know, kind of satellite enclosures. And they are really taking up a lot of space in the center of the site. They are kind of surrounded by these empty areas. Whereas on the margins of the site, we see a lot of smaller ones and a lot more crowded and more clustered together, with the exception of a really interesting pattern of very regular compounds around a central space. One aspect to bear in mind is that what we see in the satellite imagery is the result of hundreds of years of the life of the site. You know, how new people arrived and the expansion of the site. So we end up with a composite view of how people lived here. And then, you know, a future line of research, perhaps involving going to the site, would be to discern what parts of the site were inhabited at the same time versus which ones were earlier or later, you know, to really understand the trends that we see from the sky. Moving west towards the Dartagan escarpment, sorry, I want to bring to your attention how prominent this passageway through the desert is, the Taskas Wadi, that connects the Dagan Plateau with other highlands further south. And this is an interesting part of kind of southern Mauritania because of the strong concentration of funerary monuments at the entrance of this important passageway in mobility and trade. So it really highlights the attachment of these communities to place, but also to the seasonal patterns of moving through the landscape and having the ancestors in a way guiding that movement. Here we have examples at different scales of how some of these funerary monuments look like. Usually a central tumuli, sometimes surrounded by a ring of stones. But it's not only about recording what we see. We also have the opportunity to do spatial analysis using the terrain morphology and the location to understand a bit more what was the experience of visiting and kind of being in these landscapes, through attempts at modeling what would you see from these monuments, or from where do you see the monuments. This is something that you can find in more detail in the publication below. And lastly, about trade, with the advent of kingdoms in West Africa and the expansion of Islam throughout North Africa and the Middle East, we see an increasing set of interactions connecting places in Mauritania with places in Morocco, Spain, Egypt. And of particular interest for Mauritania are, of course, salt and the role it played as a middleman in the trade of gold from, these kind of shaded yellow areas are kind of the areas where gold mines and gold extraction would take place, and kind of how important was southern Mauritania in channeling that trade further north. So I wanted to show this kind of snapshot of the medieval settlement of Tedgaus, where we can really see in detail where the excavations by a French team in the 70s took place, that then allowed us to place the site in the landscape and to understand also that Islam wasn't the driving force of interaction and complexity in these regions, and that there was also an indigenous kind of root that is reflected in the presence of pre-Islamic funerary monuments scattered throughout the landscape that attest that interactions between different parts of Mauritania before Islam. And lastly, I also want to say that there is still so much to do. The area is huge, and there is certainly scope for collaboration and for further research throughout. And I wanted to say to show you some examples of the kinds of sites that I've been finding. We have really commanding sites with walls atop the valleys. We have fields of funerary tumuli, and then very complex set of settlements that at the moment are written off the global history of humanity, simply because they are not known, and other regions are giving more visibility and presence in those narratives. And Mauritania has a lot to contribute to understanding past human experiences, and hopefully that's something that with EAMENA we can do for many years to come, both through remote sensing research, but also hopefully through going into the field and really documenting all aspects of the archaeology of the region. So I want to say thank you to a number of people that have been very supportive of me, and as well the institutions that have been funding my research. And thank you so much for your attention, and please go visit the EAMENA website and learn more about the things that they do and the things that can be done in the future.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I think we're now going to go over to a question and answer if anybody's got any questions, and David and Andrew will field them, at least to start with.
Thank you. Yes, Gonzalo, that was superb, very, very clear.
So look, thank you very much indeed for those presentations. I found it fascinating, I must say, and particularly learned a lot about Mauritania, views that I've not seen of the country before. I guess my question is, you're clearly covering a hell of a lot of ground here and identifying a really impressive inventory of sites. I take the point about, you hand the database over to the kind of national authorities to be worked at that level. I just wonder, how do you or in collaboration with the national authorities kind of determine a priority list for which of these sites are most valuable, if that's an adjective, and what are your priorities for getting after the important ones first, or indeed identifying the more important ones?
Thank you. Yeah, very good question. I mean, in terms of identifying what we regard as important, that isn't necessarily what the authorities in a country might regard, and really, it's their call in terms of action on the ground. All we can do is really provide them with the best information we can obtain. And I suppose our priorities for identifying things are often more in terms of regions than sites. We're looking to find sites in a region that may be at risk, and we're looking then to see the threats within that region. So where possible, we've worked with departments of antiquities to say, well, look, what are your priorities? What are you aware of in terms of major development schemes? We did this with the Department of Antiquities of Jordan, and they said, well, look, we know there's going to be a big ring road built around Mardaba. We did a remote sensing survey of the area at risk and provided them with the information of what lay directly in the path of the ring road, what lay within a buffer zone as well. Sometimes we've also done work where we think, from what we're aware of in a country, there may be something going to happen, even if the Department of Antiquities hasn't got certain visibility of that yet. So there were stories about a new megacity to augment and replace Cairo. So we did a whole load of work to the east of the Nile, identifying stuff that would lie in the area of that. So the more conversations we can have with departments and institutions and government authorities, the more information we've got. But at the same time, we can also say, well, look, let's build on known databases. There's some amazing 19th and early 20th century work, the French Archaeological Atlas of Algeria. Let's get that digitized so that we've got, a good overview of what there is there, of known resources, and see how much change has happened and how much change may be likely to happen. Because it's not just big construction projects, and it's not just looting or wartime. The ordinary small-scale but cumulative peacetime activities, the activities of prosperity, of planting new olive groves and so on, they have a constant effect on sites.
Very good, thank you.
Good, Andrew, could I just add very briefly to your answer, and fantastic question, Roger, because it gets to the nub of why we're doing it, apart from the research side of things. And we have in all the projects and all the training said that each of the countries should come up with a list of, say, the top 100 sites on a watch list. And that's a way of having that conversation about how do you prioritize the significance and the endangerment, or whatever the threat to the sites. And for example, in England, there are criteria for deciding how to decide which sites should be listed as buildings or protected as scheduled ancient monuments. And what's fascinating is that the government says it's a non-statutory list of criteria. In other words, everybody won't agree, therefore they're not going to make it a definitive one. But it's to do with the number, the rarity, the group value. Do you want to preserve every Bronze Age barrow in the country? The answer is no, partly because none of them are left. So you want to preserve those few that are left. It's a different story across all the different countries, but it's a fascinating question, and that's what's going to keep archaeologists and cultural heritage managers in business for decades, if not centuries.
Yes, I just want to inform my friends in EAMENA that the Amber area in Mauritania has a bit moved eastwards. So Chinguetti and Wadan and Azugi are now actually in the amber zone. Okay, that says non-essential travel, but for those who can, it should not be forgotten. And second thing is, Roger, I, and Matthew will be in Nouakchott in early December to reconnect, after the COVID pandemic and continued situation, to reconnect. And I hope to get to our 3 professors in the University of Nouakchott and present me in person and try to have a conversation, because remote conversations seem to be a bit difficult at the moment. But that's just also funny. So yes, and I would like to really, I'm amazed by what the work Gonzalo has done in the meantime. It's absolutely amazing, and it shows how worthwhile it is to do this and to get the support for that, because it isn't, archaeology-wise, it is quite an unknown area, compared to other parts of the Mediterranean and the Saharan areas of Africa. But it's actually a very old archaeological area. David will want to say add something to it.
Well, yes, I was glad, Gonzalo, you brought in the issue of trade and the connectivity across the Sahara towards the end, because I think that is a fundamental theme really through all the periods in which we're looking at archaeology in the Sahara. Our tendency is to look at that vast desert and think of these communities as incredibly isolated. But what we can see through the archaeology is that very often there are connections across thousands of kilometers, cultural connections, trading connections, and so on. Again, I think just to echo back perhaps something that's been said by others, we can't save every bit of the archaeology, but the sort of projects we're involved in, it's about building up the base of knowledge that will allow us and national agencies to take sensible decisions about what are the priorities for future work, and where you can't save sites in the path of major development. Also, sometimes you can preserve by record, at least to have had some investigation of what's going to be lost. And that's, again, a really crucial area. Can I ask a question of Gonzalo, though, because I'm just interested to know whether you've looked further west from the Dar-Tichit and area that you focused on, and because so much of Mauritania is a desert landscape, and desert landscapes are extraordinarily rich in the preservation of archaeological features over time. But of course, also those landscapes are extremely vulnerable as and when development starts. So I just wonder, moving more towards the Atlantic coast, have you seen some similar archaeology?
Thank you, David. So I've tried to kind of browse through the whole of Mauritania with the satellite imagery, but I haven't been able to do so at the same kind of level of detail, because the region that I've shown is already unmanageable for a PhD. Yeah. So I've also tried to look for similar types of sites, just to see, is this something circumscribed to southeastern Mauritania, or can we see something similar in kind of the west or the central parts? But so far I haven't been able to find close parallels, mostly because stone availability might be an important factor to see, these kinds of sites, obviously. And sites without stone are a bit harder to see in general, but especially kind of in desert areas. But yes, certainly kind of the west coast of the Atlantic coast of Mauritania has a really interesting archaeological sequence that Robert Bernet in particular has explored over many years. These kind of shell mounds and that resemble things that we see in Senegal, for example. And then further north, near the mining towns of Suerat, we also have like a bunch of archaeology, and of course the the Adrar region of central Mauritania that Peter was mentioning, with Chinguetti and Wadan. It's also fascinating. And as Peter said, there we are really seeing the sand dunes entering these medieval centers of learning, because they had libraries and everything. And alongside urban development, I think the natural threats on that part of central Mauritania are particularly acute, I would say. But yes, certainly most of Mauritania has a lot of really fascinating archaeological potential that can hopefully be explored.
I mean, I guess, and I might be quite wrong, but I guess we're at one of those times in recent history where, with the security difficulties of the instability in the Sahel, ongoing problems in Libya, this must be one of the more difficult phases for you as archaeologists to get in and do field work and ground truth, the observations from remote sensing. Do you observe that the national agencies are still able to continue work in countries with instability, where perhaps you as foreign individuals would encounter too great a security risk?
Shall I just kick off on this? I mean, others may want to join in, but certainly with my long established contacts in Libya, it's been
nice to see you again, David. Yes.
Indeed. It's been a particularly difficult time, obviously. And actually my difficulties as a foreign archaeologist who wants to get into Libya are nothing compared to the difficulties that our Libyan colleagues and friends have been facing, and particularly, I think, within the Antiquities Department, because we have seen an absolute explosion of land grabbing, illicit activity around heritage assets and destruction, at a time when the sort of legal controls on all of that have become anarchic at best. So we've done our best, really, and the EAMENA project has been crucial for allowing us to try to help and support our Libyan colleagues by feeding them information. On some occasions we've been able to operate in partnership, and they've gone and visited sites that we've identified on satellite imagery as showing signs of damage, and follow up on the ground. But clearly working in the most difficult of situations, where some of the regional warlords are really not people you want to be messing with and saying you've just bulldozed a classical site.
And if I could just chip in, I don't know if you were at the same seminar, David, when we were at the training thing in Tunisia, and one of the participants from Libya, and he was from the south, and he was saying how he got a particularly difficult person as a landowner and a miner in a quarry, and he didn't really want to go, and he wondered whether I or David could go in his stead and have the conversation with him. And we went, no, I think it's better if you have the conversation with that person. But it's incredible just how resilient and how far they're willing to put, often their lives in danger for the sake of the archaeology, and it is really impressive, which makes the work that much more important, as we know from Syria as well.
Yeah, just to chip in on that. I mean, Syria, of course, was the famous occasion when a local director of antiquities was taken out and executed because he was hiding antiquities from ISIS at Palmyra, and that. An extreme case, but it is the case that local archaeologists have been targeted, that we're aware of. And some of the work we're doing where we can't work with the state body because we can't talk to the Syrians directly with government funding, we are having to work very carefully with non-state archaeologists who are recording as private citizens the damage that's being done. But we have to be very careful that we don't get them into difficulties that way. But it's again not just conflict. I mean, with when there's a big industrial development, for example, and many of these countries, particularly the ones without oil that sort of live in the shadow of the richer ones, are looking for jobs and employment, and if a big industrial development comes along, many of them will grasp it, while saying on the other hand that this is going to destroy our own heritage. So there's a lot of personal conflicts in the local population, which I think we need to take account of. But one of the the whole points of what we're doing, and it goes back to your previous question, is that by giving them the information, it's easier for people to set their own priorities. And that's why we don't just record the things that are under threat. We try and record comprehensively so that they can then sample out of them and say, well, that's a lost cause. And the same, I mean, it's the same rules that may be more clear in Britain, where we, you know, if the economic benefit or whatever is more important, the heritage can be removed with excavation or whatever. And it's to try and help that, encourage that, so that there can be a proper balance, a proper assessment, and where necessary, mitigation, excavation and recording or whatever. And that I think is at the heart of a lot of what we do.
There are no more questions in the chat. Shall I then, on behalf of MBBC, give you an absolutely huge thank you for that. We've done many webinars on many subjects, and I don't want to offend any of our ministerial guests and everything, but I think that was the most interesting of them all. It's a really fascinating subject, and I think one of the points is that, you know, 99.999% of people, even those interested in archaeology, will never ever get to any of these sites in Mauritania. And the fact that you're planning to work on them and record them, whether they survive, whether they don't survive, is, you know, is hugely beneficial. And I think we're very grateful to you for this. And, you know, I would suggest maybe we check in again and have another one of these in maybe a year's time when further progress has been made, because Mauritania is opening up a little bit now. A negative PCR test, you can enter the country. There are still some issues around quarantine, but these things are now improving all the time. So we hope you will be in country. We hope you will be doing field work there, and you know, we hope that we'll be there. So we'll see you in country. So I guess just to say thank you very much for that. Really interesting, as I've said. Thanks to Peter for chairing. Thanks to Roger for the questions, and thank you to all of you at EAMENA.
Yes, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good show,
See you.
guys.